Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Shanae Yvette Moraine Willis, Director of Community Engagement at the Digital Public Library of America. I had the incredible privilege of introducing our featured author and speaker this afternoon for a conversation about the infrastructure of the internet and how coding labor, algorithms, and content moderation policies govern what is visible and invisible online. We're pleased to partner with MIT Press to present a book talk with Alex Monea, author of The Digital Closet, How the Internet Became Straight. This discussion is particularly relevant as libraries across the United States stand together in the fight against censorship. In the foreword to The Digital Closet, author and journalist Violet Blue writes, "Our experience of the internet and therefore our ability to work, play, grow, heal, and love is warped by structures of power. The after effect of censorship is harm. Banning books and overblocking LGBTQIA plus community resources and sex positive content online rob us of the opportunity to learn and build mutual understanding." Thank you, Alex, for being with us to share this important research and how we can ameliorate harm through collective action. Alex is a digital media scholar researching the history and cultural impact of computation. Alex currently serves as assistant professor in the English Department and Cultural Studies PhD program at George Mason University. He received a PhD in communication, rhetoric, and digital media from NC State University in 2016. Alex's work examines how society influences and is impacted by machine learning and big data, with increasing emphasis on data bias and data ethics. His current work is on computer vision, image recognition, and racial and gender bias in visual data sets. The Digital Closet examines the heteronormativity of the computer vision-powered content filters that currently detect and block pornographic and racy images online. Alex shows how heteronormative bias creeps into our digital discourse, the worldview of coders, the code they write, the data sets they train that code on, and their decisions about how to adjudicate this bias after the fact. Angel Ysaguirre is the executive director of the Court Theater, the professional theater company of the University of Chicago, and will be our moderator for this afternoon. A recent recipient of the Regional Tony Award, Court Theater is a classic space theater company on Chicago's South Side, partnering with the University of Chicago faculty and students to develop dramaturgy for its productions and new play commissions. He was the executive director of Illinois Humanities, where he co-created Envisioning Justice, a collection of public humanities programs that seek to envision alternatives to enduring injustice of mass incarceration, centering the voices of people and communities most affected. He also served as a deputy commissioner at the City of Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs and Events. Before I turn it over to our moderator, some Zoom housekeeping. We ask that you ask your questions in the Q&A box in the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom window. We will monitor the chat and speakers will answer questions throughout the discussion and also at the end. Angel and Alex, over to you.
Thanks so much, Shani. Alex, so great to see you. Thank you for this opportunity to chat with you about the book. I think you were doing a bit of a reading before we start our conversation, though. Is that right?
Yeah.
Great. Well, I will turn off my camera and come back on after the reading is over.
All right. Thanks so much, Anya. It's good to see you. And Shani, thank you for the wonderful introduction. And to the DPLA, it's great to be here and to have this opportunity to chat with you all. So I think what I'll do before we turn to the sort of dialogical part of the conversation today is give you a little bit of background about how this book came about, do a short reading from the introduction that sort of lays out what I do in the book, and then give you a little bit of a breakdown of what comes after the introduction in each of the chapters of the book, so you have a sort of good sense of what the argument is, and that way you can participate in Q&A even if you haven't had a chance to read the book at this point. So this book has sort of a strange origin story in the sense that I didn't set out to write it. It kind of found me and became a book almost without me intending it to. When I finished my PhD program, I had been looking at natural language processing algorithms And I got invited to be on a panel with a bunch of folks that were working more in visual studies. And so I decided that image recognition algorithms, computer vision algorithms, from what I knew about them, were similar in structure enough that I could translate over some of what I had been doing in critiquing natural language processing algorithms, and be able to understand them at least sufficiently to produce a critique that would be interesting. And as I was prepping for this panel, I was trying to think of image recognition algorithms that would be interesting to look at. And one of the things I quickly found was most of the image recognition algorithms that I had heard of as someone that follows tech news, Wired, TechCrunch, places like that, were at the time instances of image recognition algorithms that were terribly bad, right? So it would think that a tree was a rocket ship, or a basketball was Jupiter, or things like that. And so I wanted to find an image recognition algorithm that was actually performing successfully and at scale to look into. And when I thought about it, the only ones that I could think of that were operating at a large scale and performing somewhat successfully were porn filters, right? So if you're, I don't know, above 30, you might remember a time when most searches on Google, and when Google image search came out, most Google image searches would lead to pornography. If not in the top couple results, if you kept scrolling, kept looking through pages of results, you would almost inevitably wind up in pornography. And this was almost a game for me when I was in high school and in undergrad. My friends and I would try to type the most banal search terms that we could into Google and see if we could find one that didn't eventually lead to porn. So you would type things like bagel, lawn chair, things like that. And this was a really hard game to win because so much of the internet in its infrastructure eventually led to pornography in those days. And then somewhere around 2012, Google broke this game, and you just stopped seeing porn in organic search results and in image search results. And so I thought this would be, a good algorithm to start looking at. And as I started digging into it and figuring out how it was operating, one of the things that I found was that the data sets that it was trained on had a lot of sort of baked in heteronormative biases. And when I started to look at how these algorithms were operating online, I just found many complaints from content creators about queer content being unduly censored. And most often the industry response was that this was a one-off event, a sort of anomaly, not a sort of systemic attribute. They would call it a bug, not a feature of their content moderation algorithms. And so one of my hopes with the book is that by stitching together just an endless number of examples, we can sort of start to view this queer censorship online as more of a feature of the internet than a bug, something that is definitely happening systemically. And so people that are producing content and having it taken down unduly can't be gaslit in the future about sort of why their content's getting taken down or how these algorithms are operating. So I'll read for you now a chunk of the introduction. And like I said, after that, I'll give you sort of a breakdown of the chapters and what comes in each of them. And there is some strong language in this introduction, but it is Mark Zuckerberg's and not mine. So I hope you can handle that. So the book opens with a quote from Mark Zuckerberg's communications that was leaked, I think around 2010. And Mark Zuckerberg says, "I don't know why. They trust me, dumb fucks. We do not use social media and other internet platforms because we trust them, or at least nobody in my social circle seems to be such a dumb fuck, in the words of Facebook founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg. We use such platforms despite a lack of trust because they are no longer opt-in systems. The structure of the contemporary economy and governance increasingly demands digital participation. We are generally aware that the cost of this participation is our privacy. We submit to ceding our privacy upon realization that participation is not optional. Escaping the scope of digital surveillance is near impossible, even if participation were truly optional. But what if the costs are greater than a total loss of privacy? It's hard to imagine that the asking price for access to internet platforms could be higher, but it is. I'll be making the case throughout this book that the cost of admission also includes the continued marginalization of LGBTQIA+ communities, and the amplification of misogyny and heteronormativity as they become automatically reproduced across the internet. This has both symbolic and material impacts on society. Decades of scholarship have demonstrated that representation in the media matters, that public visibility helps determine our collective assessment of who matters, which issues are important, and what our obligations are as a society. It also has material impacts on members of the LGBTQIA+ community, like lack of access to health information, online community, online revenue streams, and the precarity of having to seek out things like dates, community, and customers offline. The rhetoric of Silicon Valley is filled with imagined inevitabilities. This is perhaps nowhere truer than in the rise of online content moderation. Billions upon billions of pieces of content are being uploaded to internet platforms every year. How could any individual, human or corporate, ever hope to keep up? Human nature can be brutish, hypersexualized, and vile. How can we hope to stem the deluge of offensive content reflective of these facts? In typical TED Talk fashion, we are asked to believe that there is only one solution, and that it's a panacea: automated content moderation. By leveraging advanced machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques, the web can learn to police itself, and algorithmically organized humans can pick up any slack. In so doing, the machines will be able to parse what we'll term sexual speech, a broad term meant to encapsulate all potentially adult content, from discourse about sex to sex education to pornography and other online sex work. However, a machine learning algorithm is only as good as its input data and training parameters. Unfortunately, when it comes to moderating sexual speech, the data is hopelessly flawed, and the parameters designed by Silicon Valley coders are not much better. They all contain heteronormative biases so severe it would be comical if it weren't so damn tragic. Our collective social discourse in the United States, particularly that which occurs online, contains rampant anti-LGBTQIA+ biases. Contrary to many popular narratives, these biases have increased in recent years. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation's annual Accelerating Acceptance report, conducted by the Harris Poll, reports radical declines in queer acceptance in the United States since 2016. The percentage of non-LGBTQIA+ 18 to 34-year-olds classified as allies, those who report being very or somewhat comfortable with queer individuals in all situations, dropped precipitously in the Trump era. Whereas 63% of the US population were classified as allies in 2016, that number dropped to 45% by 2018. And the total of male allies dropped from 62% to only 35%. Many of the most powerful internet platforms are based in the United States and are deeply impacted by these biases. The prejudices of a particularly vocal subsection of the population infect the training data, code, and coders behind automated content moderation to deleterious effects. The resulting algorithms end up over-scrutinizing, policing, and suppressing queer discourse, including community forums, resources, outreach initiatives, activism, sex education, women's bodies, sex workers, and pornography. People targeted for algorithmic censorship have little recourse, while large vertically integrated corporations like mainstream hetero-porn production companies, the types of San Fernando Valley companies that produce aggressively heterosexual, frequently misogynistic, and now almost exclusively gonzo or point of view porn, may escape censorship. Niche content producers of sexual speech ranging from queer advocacy to feminists and queer pornography are rarely so lucky. The result of this new regime of automated content moderation is what I call the digital closet. This term is meant to signify the ways in which queer individuals may be allowed to enter the digital public sphere, but only so long as they bracket and obscure their sexual identities. Their very being is so pornographied by automated content filters that they are largely barred from sexual expression online. To participate in our digital world, as is increasingly necessary today, requires a silence that is alienating and damaging. Any exit from the digital closet will be met with swift punishment. Queer people will find their content flagged and censored, their account banned or deprioritized, and thus rendered invisible, will lose any streams of online revenue, and will find the system weaponized against them by alt-right trolls looking to trigger all the aforementioned punishments. To add insult to injury, all of this will occur while tube sites like Pornhub operate walled gardens of heteronormative sexual expression, unhindered by the new platform economy. It seems as if a treaty has been made between the people in a moral panic over the proliferation of pornography and the internet platforms, and this treaty is at the expense of the queer community. Porn will be given a corner of the internet where it will flourish, as long as it's not that kind of porn. And I want to read a little bit more from a section that starts to talk about what I call the collateral damage of this war on pornography. There's a much larger problem that the war on porn introduces than its heteronormalization of pornography. Unless the reader think that they've gotten themselves into an entire book on hardcore pornography, they can rest assured that the bulk of the book, in fact, is focused on this spillover effect where any and all sexual speech gets overly censored. Every war on porn produces this collateral damage, by which I mean that regulation is more often than not applied over broadly and ends up censoring large amounts of non-pornographic content, particularly sex education materials, queer activism, and queer community building discourse. This overbroad censorship is especially prevalent once the rhetoric of children's unwanted exposure is used to drum up support for anti-porn regulation. Once this rhetorical trope is leveraged, it easily becomes possible for people to perceive the unwanted censorship of some non-pornographic material as immensely preferable to even a single piece of pornography slipping through and being seen by children. In the Comstock era at the turn of the 20th century, for instance, this overbroad application of obscenity regulations led to the censorship of art, literature, and sex education materials, such as those circulated by suffragettes like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which provided information about reproductive health and birth control methods. In the middle of the 20th century, the Supreme Court's efforts to channel community standards in regulating obscenity led to their censorship of queer magazines, despite letting Playboy build a global pornographic empire. The same problem recurs today, except it is occurring at web scale, and the regulations are being produced secretly by internet platforms and adjudicated by opaque algorithms and inaccessible offshore temporary content moderation laborers, who often render their decisions in a matter of seconds. Every post, picture, and link on the internet is now subject to this invisible censorship mechanism. While this book will be primarily focused on the impacts that the overzealous censorship of sexual speech online has on queer communities, decades of feminist scholarship tells us that heteronormativity's deep connections with patriarchy and misogyny mean that it is a detriment to straight people as well, and one that is borne inordinately by women of color. This line of argument is taken up most forcefully by Jane Ward in her recent book, The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, where she argues that heterosexuality is erotically uninspired or coercive, given shape by the most predictable and punishing gender roles, emotionally scripted by decades of inane media and self-help projects, and outright illogical as a set of intimate relations anchored in a complaint-ridden swirl of desire and misogyny. Ward argues that feminism and queer theory ought to look outward and examine more closely the tragedy of heterosexuality, evidenced by a long history of what she terms the heterosexual repair industry. The contradictions and tensions in heterosexuality, which will be further examined below, have produced over 100 years of industries, including eugenics, psychiatry, sexology, porno magazines, homosocial spaces, from fraternal clubs to video game squads, self-help books and seminars, hygiene products like soaping, douching, bleaching, the beauty industry, the fitness industry, seduction and relationship coaches, and so on, all meant to fix straight people and deliver the promises of heterosexual monogamous marital bliss. In Ward's eyes, heterosexuals suffer from boredom, complaint, lack of imagination, the straight gaze and objectification, bad sex, and an obsession with genitals, all of which might be alleviated by queering straightness and introducing feminism to dissipate the rampant misogyny. In short, everyone suffers from the heteronormativity of the internet, a point that I will try to gesture toward throughout the book without losing the more precise focus on queer communities. I think that this focus on a well-recognized category of marginalized identity that is already connected to broader activist networks is strategically useful, as it stands a better chance of leading to the mobilization of resistance against the internet's heteronormativity. Further, the legal recognition of sexuality, as for instance in Title IX, as a protected identity class, makes this a tactically strong point from which to attack content moderation online. Lastly, the case studies in the book most clearly highlight a trend toward anti-queer prejudice in the operations of algorithms and content moderation online, despite the wider implications this has for cisgender heterosexual audiences. All of these considerations are essential because there's been no large-scale study to this point on the impact of heteronormative content moderation online. Only a few pioneering journalists have kept any sort of record of the myriad people and pieces of their non-pornographic content that have been censored. And Violet Blue is one of these people, as is Samantha Cole and a number of other journalists that were essential for the book. I'll rely on them heavily throughout the book to demonstrate that pornography is not all that is at stake here. The internet itself is being policed by overbroad heteronormative algorithms that are routinely censoring art, literature, and queer content across the world. Most of the book will be dedicated to making this process more transparent showing how everything from internet discourse writ large to the coders at internet platforms to the code itself to the offshore content moderators have intentionally or not become party to globalizing this uniquely American white middle-class form of heteronormativity. So the introduction goes on to try to outline a definition of what heteronormativity is, which is surprisingly the most difficult part of the book for me to have written. It's a weird and ambiguous concept that I think is nefariously ambiguous. Its flexibility allows it to metamorphose with each local setting and with each generation to continually reify power. The second chunk of the book looks at what I call the strange bedfellows in the anti-porn alliance. A lot has been written on the collaboration between anti-porn feminists and evangelical conservatives in the 70s and 80s in the war on porn. So the chapter sort of introduces some of that, but really spends a lot of time focusing on the new addition to this anti-porn crusade, which is what the media termed alt-right for about 4 years. Now they're starting to use other terms for it as well. Here I might describe them as digital misogynists, and the various ways in which they try to essentialize biological gender roles and the ways that ends up reifying heteronormativity, cisnormativity, and produces this sort of anti-pornographic platform. The third chapter looks at the ways in which this sort of discourse from the alt-right trickles into Silicon Valley. And this happens through a number of intermediaries that position themselves between sort of the daily stormer white supremacists and the sort of extreme misogynists and more palatable society. These are also the avenues by which these ideas come to be on Fox News or other mainstream television channels. A key example here would be Jordan Peterson, who sort of intermediates between these, people that would never have a voice in polite society and everyday discourse. He's sort of an intermediary between the two. And so there's sort of this trickle effect into Silicon Valley. And you can see it reflected in a lot of the culture there, the way women are treated, the way sexuality is treated in the workforce. You can see it most concretely in the book. I look at the infamous James Damore memo, where he's railing against diversity training and arguing for biologically assigned gender roles. And the way that people respond to that inside the company. The chapter then goes on to look at how this pervasive heteronormativity impacts the data sets that these algorithms are trained on. It looks at ImageNet, it looks at WordNet, and finds some pretty horrifying biases there. For instance, in the ontology, or the set of things that can exist, homosexuality is related to bestiality, masturbation is related to self-abuse. It draws on some of the most historic biases in the English language about sexuality and embeds them in the algorithm in terms of what the algorithm can see, what it can know, how it can connect things. And then the chapter turns to Facebook's offshore content moderation policy, where moderators are given on average less than 7 seconds to make a decision about what constitutes pornography. They're underpaid. The least trained workers are usually assigned to pornography because it's assumed that those decisions are easy, and the policies are made by a cloistered small group of people at Facebook, but exported globally, right? And so the chapter sort of looks at the way that policy is made and how it gets implemented by automated content moderators and some of the problems with that. The third chapter of the book is focused really on the collateral damage that occurs, and it's mostly a stitching together of hundreds of examples of different non-pornographic content that's been censored or is currently getting censored by overbroad content moderation, ranging from art and literature to sex education to queer advertisements to queer communities, all sorts of stuff like that. And then the fourth chapter of the book looks at the ways that by bracketing pornography and only allowing it to appear on tube sites like Pornhub or in very limited search results on Google, it makes it very easy for the highly capitalized San Fernando Valley porn companies to control the flow of internet traffic and make sure that straight porn, hetero porn is the top search result and the thing that most people will find. It increasingly makes it easy to search optimize and sort of dominate search results. And on Pornhub and other tube sites, it makes it easy to sort of control the metadata, and in so doing, sort of control the categories of porn that can exist and exercise undue influence on sort of what porn gets made, even amateur pornography. And then the conclusion of the book sort of looks at different things that could be done, whether they're more revisionist short-term strategies, like trying to pass anti-censorship commitments at these companies, or building public accountability mechanisms, to more revolutionary strategies like turning social media companies into public utilities, reinvigorating our democracy so that our regulatory bodies are reflective of everyday people's desires, to full on I draw from the meme here for sort of the political inspiration of fully automated luxury gay space communism, is sort of how I end the book, right? Because when you're trying to imagine a future beyond capitalism, it's really hard. And I think that utopian space that people meme about online is some of the clearest discourse I've seen about what people might want from a technology that isn't subject to heteropatriarchy and capitalism in the same way that most of our structures are today. So that's sort of the overview of the book. I will say that this being sort of the first book on the topic, a lot of this is iterative, right, and speculative. So I'm really hoping that other scholars and other people that are actually, frequently on the internet or creating content can, use this as a platform to sort of build new ideas, to make new arguments, to push it in different directions, even if that means sort of saying that everything in the book is wrong and it needs to be redone in a new way, in a better way. It's just sort of a topic that I think needs a lot more people working on it, talking about it, thinking about it, because no one perspective is going to get the picture right. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Angel for discussion, for questions, and to the audience as well.
Great. Thanks for that summation of the book. I thought I would actually start with my own summation of the book, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
So when the folks at DPLA asked if I would be in conversation with you about this book, I admit that I, at first, I'm not sure what the word is, but I sort of had a bit of resentment at first. I think because I thought, well, I'm not an internet scholar. And I thought the book was going to be about porn. I'm not sure why. I thought that the book was primarily going to be about the fact that our porn isn't as good as it used to be or something. But then I read the book and along the way, clearly saw that it was something different. And I was really struck by the time I got to the conclusion, in a way that was actually incredibly sad to me. So as I read, this is my reading of your book, which it starts with sort of this reminder of what the promise of the internet was going to be. This place where we could have the kind of generative conversations about power and sexuality and the economy, or the economy as it impacts queer people, women, people of color, especially around sex and sexuality. And that this series of actions, sort of structured by heteronormativity, as you argue in the book, have really dialed that back over years. And you spend much of the book analyzing that and making connections. And then by the time one gets to the conclusion, or at least by the time I got to the conclusion, I realized that we were back in the closet. And I was thinking about a couple of things along the way. One was, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years ago, I don't remember exactly how long it was. being at a panel in which young gay people were talking about their relationship to the internet. And I remember there was a teenager from a small town in Illinois who was Asian American, and he talked about how on Craigslist he would put on different personas, that he got to experience the world as a non-Asian American man, or a non-Asian American young man. And the things that he learned about himself, but also about gay culture and the structure of gay culture in Illinois, by being able to play around on the internet in the way that he was. And I remember friends also, constantly trying to convince me that it was now cool to be gay. And at the same time, when I was doing grant making and reviewing proposal after proposal about homeless teens, most of whom were kicked out because their parents learned that they were gay and no longer cared to have them at home. And so I always knew that it was actually never cool to be gay. But I don't think I realized the ways in which maybe queer people were being pushed back into the closet as a result of this series of technological stuff that you talk about. I did want to ask, and I know you did it a little bit, but I wonder if you would, and maybe you don't want to because you spent so much time doing it in the book, but I wonder if you would give us a synopsis, if that's possible, of what heteronormativity is, because I feel like it's so important to the argument that you make throughout the book.
Yeah, sure. I can try. I can't promise it will, it took me so long to nail down the moving pieces. So it might not be as good as I've done it in the book. And even in the book, I don't know that I'm satisfied with it. But I think there's sort of two poles that I see sort of attracting different sort of social structures into the matrix of heteronormativity. One is sort of this, and this is based off of research in America, right? So that, and this is a particularly sort of American story of heteronormativity, largely because that's where these companies are based, and that's the sort of ideology they're drawing off of. But one is sort of this early sort of Puritan impulse towards theologically organized heterosexuality, right? All sex is for procreation, right? Sex for pleasure, even when you're married and together, monogamously married. It's taboo, right? Sex isn't for pleasure; it's just for procreation. And this occurs in the 1600s, 1700s, and is one of the sort of dominant ideological forms of sexuality in the United States. Until we have the emergence of a sort of biological understanding of sexuality, right? It starts, the term heterosexuality actually originates as a disorder. It was meant to describe men and women that would have sort of opposite sex intercourse too frequently, right? So it was someone that liked to have sex, a man that liked to have sex with women too much, or a woman that liked to have sex with men too much. And it's hard to talk about this without like being cisgendered, right? Because all these definitions are, dependent on a sort of cisgender binary. But there's this new sort of understanding of sexuality as a drive, right? First as a disordered drive, and later it becomes naturalized to the point where it's understood that people have a drive towards, sexual fulfillment, a libidinal drive. And these two sort of poles come into contact with each other and reach what I would call maybe a détente, right? So you can have sex for pleasure, but it has to meet some of the old theological confines, right? So it has to be monogamous, heterosexual, in a marriage, things like that. And in America, at least, you see these sort of détentes continually arise, right? So in the 1920s, it becomes the case that like you can have sex with someone you intend to marry and are in love with, but maybe aren't married to yet, right? And then maybe it's more like today, where like you can have sex with someone that you are dating and you are monogamously committed to and are in love with if they're the opposite gender, and that's sort of perceived as heterosexuality, right? So these sort of two major organizing poles around like a theological drive to procreation and a biological libidinal drive are always sort of in contradiction at the heart of it. And that contradiction sort of attaches itself to other structures and other ideas, such as how many people can be in the room where you have sex, where can you have sex, what other sort of instruments or objects can be a part of it, what sort of role-playing scenarios are normal, what positions, right? So all these other sort of peripheral things get spun into this web. But at the heart of it, it's always this contradiction between like libido and like procreation. And I think that contradiction makes it really hard to ever nail it down, and it makes it always changing. And for me, as I was defining it, I realized that was like the most nefarious part of heterosexuality, was that you can never like refute it or kill it, right? Because it's not a consistent or coherent sort of idea, and it's like a hydra. If you cut one head off, like two more will sprout up. It really ended up reminding me of Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart when he was deciding, how to define pornography. I think this was in '73. Said, "I know it when I see it," right? And it's kind of the same thing with heterosexuality or particularly heteronormativity, right? Like I can tell sort of intuitively when something's operating heteronormatively, but like pinning it down exactly, I think for a lot of us is really difficult. And so that would maybe be my first stab at it. But if you have ideas that might help me clarify it, I am always looking for them.
No, I mean, I don't have anything to add to it. I was struck by a couple of things along the way for sure. I mean, one is the very scary statistic about the incredible drop in the percentage of hetero folks who say that they're allies to queer people, and that number declined so sharply during Trump's presidency. And so I'm curious as to what it is about that time that shifted people from saying that they are allies or seeing themselves as allies to not being allies. But also there's something that you mentioned a few times that I am really struck by. One is the extent to which, because of heteronormativity, queer bodies and the bodies of people of color are continuously sexualized. So you talk a few times about women having to cover their nipples, or at least, about female bodies having to have nipples covered while male bodies don't have to have nipples covered, because we're sexualizing the female body, and the way in which we also sexualize queer bodies and the way in which we sexualize the bodies of people of color. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about what seems to me like almost an anxiety over the bodies of people of color, queer people and women, and the ways in which it's made, in which it might be shaped by heteronormativity or not. I don't know. I was just so struck by that in the book. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Angel, that the two answers are connected, right? So I don't have a full answer for, how the Trump era did so much damage across so many domains, right? I think that's something that we'll be unpacking for generations, but it definitely seemed to, normalize extremist opinions. So maybe people that potentially were allies before in name only now felt comfortable, claiming on a survey that they weren't anymore. I know that it definitely opened up the sort of intermediary position between extremist points of view and mainstream media, right? So you have more people that are able to sort of filter ideas from the like extreme right, like white supremacists, patriarchs, people like that online, and get it into public discourse. I think that's a a big part of it as well. You definitely see more people like ascribing to biologically determined gender roles, right, than you would have 10 years ago, or at least I see it constantly, and it's shocking, right? Because even in the course of the book, I went and met with one of the neurologists whose reports these people draw on for evidence, right? Because they always want to like make their arguments pseudoscientific, so they'll like cite things and try to sound scientific, and the sort of implications of her findings were very different from the way that they were being mobilized by the alt-right online. And so I think that these sort of ideas, particularly around biological essentialism and gender and sexuality, have trickled into the mainstream more, and that might be part of it as well as these anti-porn activists have very successfully leveraged two rhetorical strategies that I think are very hard to combat, right? One is that they use the term children in all of their legislation, right? And they'll use the term children whether they're talking about a 17-year-old looking at pornography online or a 3-year-old, right? Which is a very, very different thing to consider, right? It's very different to think about sort of what access a 15, 16, 17-year-old should have to pornography, particularly queer pornography, than it is like a 3-year-old. And so it's a mobilized use of the term children as a rhetorical strategy to make it impossible to vote against them in these bills. And you see the same thing with the conflation of sex work with sex trafficking, right? The assumption that every sex worker is a sex trafficking victim, and who wants to vote against a bill that's protecting people from sex trafficking. And so I think these tropes have also really floated out into public consciousness. I mean, they were there already, but they're getting renewed, right? And so I think we have a sort of public discourse now that is more cisnormative, more heteronormative, afraid of pedophilia, afraid of children seeing porn, afraid of children's sexuality in general, including adolescent sexuality, and afraid of sex trafficking, right? This is all sort of in this nebulous of contemporary anxiety. And I think that the way that this connects to your second question about sort of what the deal is with this like anxiety over queer and colored bodies in particular, I think a lot of it's advertiser driven, right? A lot of the motivation for these companies to enact these algorithms and make them as strict as they are is the fear that advertisers will pull their dollars, because the assumption is that no advertiser wants their ad to appear alongside pornographic content, and no advertiser wants pornographic ads to appear alongside their ads or alongside their organic content. And so I think the advertisers are really taking a sort of litmus test of the most sort of anxious and conservative Americans, and using that to determine sort of what's acceptable in public discourse, because they need their ads to be safely delivered. And so a lot of it is sort of I think the political economy of the web, right? We have a lot of anxious people that are fueled by a lot of this sort of Trump era discursive shift, advertisers that are trying to navigate that, and because of that they're very anxious about sort of what can appear alongside ads, and pushing companies to more aggressively mobilize. That's one answer of it. There's also a lot more on the sort of historical sexualization of these bodies and anxiety around them.
Yeah, something that was a huge shift in my thinking came from Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, in which he argues, I think really well, that public opinion doesn't shape policy, but policy actually shapes public opinion. And so when policy is passed that is more beneficial to people of color, that more Americans generally are more in favor then of racial equity versus the other way around. And I wonder if during the Trump era, as Trump and his administration roll back freedoms legislatively, whether or not that also impacted then what people's opinions were. I feel like over the past year, I've been donating more and more money to libraries around the country that are under threat because of politicians restricting what books they can have in their collections. And so that's been uppermost in my mind. Of course, the things that I've been tracking are primarily books that talk about gay or trans issues. And one of the things that you talk about a lot in the book that I was really struck by was overblocking, and especially about YouTube. I know that YouTube is such an important tool for Gen Zers. And so this issue of overblocking is a really important one. I hadn't thought quite so much about the way in which the things we consume shape what we understand about ourselves. And the overblocking seems like the impact is so harsh. Would you speak a little bit about overblocking and about YouTube? But I mean, just because this is playing itself out in libraries, right? Both in terms of what can be physically on the shelves, but also what libraries can offer in their spaces online.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I think libraries have been one of the few places that I've seen constantly in battle over the past 20, 30 years about the censorship of obscenity, right? They were the ones that challenged the Child Internet Protection Act in 1999, took it to the Supreme Court, and have been sort of organizing behind the scenes for 2+ decades now. As far as YouTube goes, I think that there's been a bevy of content creators that have demonstrated their content getting taken down for references to sort of queer themes, right? And this is non-pornographic content. This is people telling their coming out stories, talking about their first date, talking about their first partner, sort of normal stories that a lot of people in a younger age bracket describe as like incredibly like therapeutic and helpful and resonating with them as YouTube audiences are getting taken down, right? And YouTube's response is usually that this was a mistake, that they'll fix it, that it's not a feature of the system. But as you look, it's continued to happen over at least 3 to 4 years. These complaints have been piling up, and it does seem to be somewhat systematic. It gets even more ramped up when you think about YouTube's restricted mode, which can be activated by parents, it can be activated by libraries, it can be activated by public institutions for anyone on their sort of network. And YouTube's restricted mode makes it even worse, right? So one of the examples that Angel always stands out to me from the book is there's a content creator called Neon Fiona who's bi. And if you look at her channel in sort of regular YouTube, she has videos about her first boyfriend, about her first girlfriend, about her first date with a man, her first date with a woman, right? And it sort of captures the sort of her everyday bisexual experiences. And if you switch it to restricted mode, all of the stuff about her having girlfriends disappears, and it changes Neon Fiona from bi to straight. And I think that this is like, for me, one of the like most isolated sort of examples of what's going on across YouTube, right? We're worried about a "Don't Say Gay" bill in Florida when we already have a sort of "Don't Say Gay" policy on most of our social media sites and in a lot of different ways. And I think the impact it has is huge, right? Especially for people that might grow up with families that aren't safe to talk with this stuff about, and communities where it's not safe to talk about this sort of stuff. Being able to sort of find community online before you're old enough to sort of leave home and find it on your own is really helpful in a number of ways for young people. And I'm very worried about their ability to access it, right? Because I'd say maybe this is a question you'd have on how. It's one that other people have asked me, which is sort of, some queer spaces do still exist online, right? Like, especially for people in the know, right? And I think my worry is like, I remember reading this article from Michael Warner and Lauren Berlant about why you needed like queer streets in big cities where there were like sex toy shops and porn shops and stuff like that. And part of the thing is like, it was public facing for the first time, and you knew like where to go to like find the community, right? And I think that as you take sort of queer search results off of Google, take queer content off of Facebook, those spaces might still exist online, but sort of the pathways to get there sort of disappear, right? It's kind of like going back to a time where like you need word of mouth to sort of tell you where to go to like find the scene. And if you don't know someone that knows, you're just out of luck. And that's really my worry, because like I think a lot of people think young people are much more fluent with the internet than they actually are, right? Like I teach 18-year-olds all the time. They're not as good at finding things on Google or finding things online as we all expect them to be. And as these spaces sort of get cordoned off, I don't know how many people that need them aren't going to find them.
Yeah, I think we should probably go to questions from the audience, but I do want to ask one last question before I do that. I think it's in the last chapter of the book. You mentioned a number of businesses that have been impacted by the fact that different places in the economy, because of fear of the impact of regulation or other things, will no longer do business with these smaller companies. And so the smaller companies have fewer freedoms. You actually mentioned the name of someone who owns a feminist sex shop in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And I know that she's come under incredible hardship as a result of the kind of actions that you talk about, especially early on in the book. And I, you know, if I'm correct in my assumption, and I could be wrong, I feel like it's the work that she's done to advocate for trans people that's really brought a lot of punishment down on her business. And I think about the fact that white gay men, especially those who could pass as straight, you know, I think about the freedoms that they have and have been able to win that others don't, right? That queer people of color don't have. Or that people with less financial resources don't have, or even the example you just used, people who know how to navigate the internet more easily don't have. And I wonder if some of this backlash has to do with the fact that that this binary of gender is being increasingly questioned, especially among young people, right? Like it's younger people who are no longer identifying as either male or female. Do you think that opening up that space has led to a greater backlash? I'm wondering if maybe the questioning of the gender binary is also leading to such an incredible amount of anxiety.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's the case, Angel. I mean, first off, I think it's a really important point that maybe I didn't stress enough, which was that you know, when I'm talking about internet platforms, I'm also talking about financial services, right? These people are getting kicked off of PayPal, Venmo, Patreon, right? So it's materially impacting their livelihoods. As far as the question, I definitely think that's the case. I think maybe, you know, there was a thought that we had reached a detente, right, where we could assimilate gay men through like concepts of homonormativity and funneling them into sort of monogamous marriages, and like understand queerness through the scope of heteronormativity, right? And this new challenge really sort of bucks that assumption, and I think it definitely is triggering a lot of violence and anger and anxiety. And you know, trans issues do seem to be at the center of a lot of these, right? The deplatforming has as much to do, I think, with sort of that part of the cultural moment as it has to do with sort of fosta sesta and the like fear of facilitating any sort of sex work, right? So it's to the point where like if you own a sex toy company or sex education company, if you even post something that makes safe sex sound fun, you get banned. You can't advertise anymore. So it might, like if it was just like anti-trans sentiment, right? Maybe that'd be easier to deal with. It's like it's full on anti-sex, and it just compiles as you add more intersectional identities to that, and it gets worse and worse.
Yeah. I'm not sure exactly how we take questions from the audience, but I know we're supposed to. So if there are any folks in the audience who would like to ask questions, I think folks could either put it in the chat or I don't know, can people turn on their camera and ask questions? Maybe someone.
I think we can take them from the Q&A box, and there's one waiting for you in there if you
Oh,
just
there
click
is
on Q&A in the bottom of
okay.
your screen.
Oh, great. Oh, there it is. Thank you. Alex, the question is, what role do online games, video games, etc., play in this space?
Yeah, thanks to the audience member. I mean, the honest answer is I don't have a good answer for this, right? I have a couple students that are really digging into this, but looking at sort of the video game production industry and video game communities was not something that I got as deep into. I think that some of these themes recur there, right? Like gaming was structured as a homosocial space, and there's a lot of anxiety about it being infiltrated by people that A, don't use it for gaming, and B, have non-normative identities, and that leads to some of the same issues. And I do know that people from the gaming space are involved in sort of the anti-sex organizing, particularly the thought audit. But as far as sort of whether video games are censoring expressions of sexual identity, and in which cases, and how that impacts sort of the exploration of sexuality in games, is not something that I looked into very much, and I don't know as much about. I'd have to bring one of my students on that studies video games to talk more about it.
Since we don't have any other questions yet, I will then ask one more, which I really wanted to ask you. Okay. The part of the book that really surprised me the most, because as you described things, I thought, oh, I hadn't thought about that, but it makes sense as I read it, is actually the section about coders. I feel like the apotheosis of the geek has, I don't know, my reading of it in my own personal relationships was that the geeks were actually really progressive, and the geeks that you're describing aren't at all. So I don't know what the question is, except that I'm so shocked. I mean, to go from the chapter about Proud Boys and incels to then this chapter about who coders are. I was so surprised by that, and I guess I'll just end by saying I'm surprised and see if there's anything you want to say about that. But I had a very different notion of who coders are generally.
Yeah, I mean, the two things there. I mean, I think we have to think about what it means to be progressive might be different for some of these folks, right? Like they might be very interested in disruption and new technologies and in sort of breaking down some norms, but there are others that they're stuck on, right? And this is historically the case with Silicon Valley, right? You could look at Fred Turner's book that I love, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, looks at how people that were living on communes sort of got fused with libertarian business practices, and that's where the origins of like the California ideology and like a lot of tech moguls come out of this sort of tradition. And so it's hard to sort of fit into our political binaries, right? They're like economically libertarian and in some ways socially conservative, in other ways socially progressive. And again, I can't speak for all of them, but when you start looking at sort of people's reporting of their experiences there and what little systematic data has been collected there, it does seem to be the case that there's a widespread heteronormativity, misogyny, things like that going on there. And when I present that part of the book, that's the thing that most often when I present it to people from Silicon Valley, they tell me it resonates with them, which I actually thought I'd get more pushback on it, right? Because I'm just giving a bird's eye view, and I figured people's everyday experiences might be very different from that. But so far, it seems like that has been a lot of people's experience. Again, and they're working at major companies, right? It might be different working at a company that has a mission that you align with. But if you're working at, Facebook or Google, they give lip service to equity and diversity and things like that. But on the actual coding teams, I'm not sure that that's the case.
Thank you. There are two questions in the chat. I'll read them both and then see how you want to respond to them, because I think we're out of time. The first question is, where does something like Reddit fit into this landscape? The diversity of the communities seem like an absolute value, but it also fosters some of the worst as well. And then the other question is, how do you reckon with a technologically literate governing body?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I think Reddit is a really interesting case. And actually, when I was answering questions for someone else in another interview, Reddit seems to me like a piece of like legacy internet, right? Like it and Craigslist are really the last like major hubs on the internet that remind me of sort of the interface and the interactions that used to be popular on the internet. And that's sort of includes both the best potentials, right, where people give free information and reviews and help each other, and the worst potential where people are like awful trolls and just posting the most horrible stuff. And Reddit's also an interesting counterexample to a lot of what I look at, because they really have sort of decentralized content moderation, right? It's up to volunteer moderators to moderate most of the stuff on the site, and there's very few global decisions that they've made other than, you know, shutting down a few subreddits like the Donald. And they try not to sort of make those decisions. So I think Reddit's an interesting counter example. I don't know how, I definitely don't think it's a friendly space for like queer community building. And I don't know how many you know, queer youth use it, but it's an interesting counterexample in ways that you can sort of try to operate content moderation at scale without automating it. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting example. It's an outlier from a lot of what I look at in the book, and the toxicity there might make it not a great example for sort of a queer utopian space that I'm trying to imagine in the book, but also an interesting case study for how you might think about doing content moderation better at a decentralized level.
And the final question, how do you reckon with a technologically illiterate governing body? Which, yeah, I mean, I will say one thing that I'm struck by late in the book is the way in which I think the Lindsey Graham example that you give of new legislation, or at least the attempt at new legislation is using the regulation of the internet as a way of regulating bodies, queer bodies.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say one or two things here. I'd say, you know, when you're talking about a technologically illiterate governing body, I think a lot of what you're talking about is, you know, the people that make it onto TV, like senators, who have technologically literate staff working for them. They just don't know how to say the right thing on camera, and so they get, you know, video footage taken of them that gets shared on TikTok and Twitter and stuff, where they look very stupid asking foolish questions of tech CEOs. I don't think that it's impossible to you know, have elected representatives regulate technology, or bureaucrats, right, regulators that aren't on TV and actually understand these issues better regulate technology. I think the issue is even worse than that, though. It's like, how do we make it so that our elected representatives actually represent us? And that has a lot more to do with like getting big money out of elections and changing democratic structures. And that's a much harder issue. The myth that Silicon Valley is smarter than everyone else and should never be regulated is a very intentional myth that they create and spend, you know, millions of dollars lobbying to perpetuate. The people in Silicon Valley don't make great decisions all the time. They're not always the smartest people in the room. It's just hard for me to buy into sort of the mythos that they want to shroud themselves in. And I think they could be regulated quite effectively.
Well, Alex, thank you for your presentation, and thanks for the conversation. I think I'll hand things back over to Shanae to close us out.
Yes. Thank you. A huge thank you to Alex Monea and Angel Ysaguirre. Alex, you didn't make a plea, but I'll make one on your behalf. Go out and get the book. There's so much that wasn't able to be discussed in this 1 hour session, so please get the book and read it for yourself. Thank you to MI Press, and thank you all for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Shanae.
Everybody.
Right, I'm a terrible salesman. You can go buy it from your local bookstore, though, please, if you can. Don't give Amazon your money if you can avoid it. And thank you all for having me. If anyone has, examples of their content getting censored or wants to talk more, you can @ me on Twitter or send me an email. I'm easy to find online. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.